Tim Parks is a British novelist who's lived in Italy for the last 28 years. His book Europa was shortlisted for the Booker, and his latest novel is entitled Cleaver. Cleaver is about a media celebrity show host who's just performed his best interview, I think. He thinks it's one of his most memorable, with the President of the United States. So he's on a high, and his son has just come out with a novel that serves as a cleaver, publicizes the life of the publicizer. This event cleaves Mr. Harold Cleaver's life into two. He decides to abandon everything and go to Italy.
You're playing very hard with the name there, you know. I didn't have any of this in mind in the first paragraph. I just called him Harold Cleaver. His son's written a book called Under His Shadow. We don't know really if it's a novel or a family biography, but it's certainly trouble for Cleaver.
That phrase book, you don't know if it's a memoir or a work of fiction.
It's interesting when you have kids of your own imagining them taking your life apart. And I guess my first novel many, many years ago, the first novel that was published called Tongues of Flame, was in fact a novelized biography of our family who were very involved in the charismatic movement and exorcisms and so on. So I had to go through a certain amount of trouble with my mother after that was published. My father was already dead. I'm seeing it from a different point of view, I guess, at this point. But none of that was really in my mind when I set off on the book. It's just occurred to me a little later as I went along with it.
What you've done to others, your character is doing to you.
Cleaver is somebody who's like a master of the public space. He's like almost invented the British news voice. And at the same time feels utterly trapped by these meaningless cadences and this constant false drama of the media. He's clearly in a very difficult family situation with a wife who isn't a wife, in the sense that they don't make love and they're both having affairs. And he's clearly deeply traumatized by the death of his daughter many years ago. And there's hardly been any touch at all with his son. And his son, instead of taking him on in the private space of the family, takes him on in Cleaver's space, the public space. Or at least Cleaver sees it like that. Perhaps the son doesn't see it like that at all. So Cleaver just suddenly feels that his interview with the President of the United States, which was devastating, will actually have no effect at all on the President of the United States, because that's the nature of the media, you know. The President of the United States is sufficiently strong to ride that.
You just said it's devastating. Does Cleaver think that it's devastating to the President?
He eventually begins to realize that actually it's devastating to himself to have done such a destructive interview and to realize that it makes no difference at all.
So in other words, he spends the time in the interview trying to make himself look good, like the victor, and yet...
Not at all. He comes to the interview in a fairly violent state because he's just read his son's book about himself. Imagine a very strong interviewer facing the present President of the United States. I don't think there would be too much difficulty in making fun of the man, and that's probably why he doesn't face any very strong interviewers. The important thing here is the sense of the complete meaninglessness of this position, and also just the sense that the son has, in fact, kind of opened the can of worms most violently. In particular, as the book continues, we realize the thing that really gets at Cleaver is that the son has, in his novelized version of their life, made it seem that the father is somehow responsible for the daughter's death. In any event, the opening gesture of the book is Cleaver's decision to depart, to go and live far away from the place where he had mastery, in a part of Europe, the South Tyrol in the Alps, where they speak a German which is such a dialect that not even German speakers can understand it, and to live in total isolation, that this might be possible. So the book is really an exploration of what it means to try and detach the mind from that kind of collective back and forth that most of us live in one way or another.
Yeah, he says, I must shut my big mouth.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, I think most exhibitionists live in a sort of tension between their exhibitionism and a certain sense of being appalled at their exhibitionism. He's a man who oscillates between positions fairly wildly.
The culture, such as it is, such as it may turn out to be, Cleaver told himself firmly of the South Tyrol,
need
not be analysed, ironized, criticised, or eulogized. A recorded voice warned that the doors were about to close. The business of living in a remote mountain cabin need not be dramatized or serialized, nor written up into a sort of Walden. Now, with the advent of all of these blogs, it seems that confession is the mode of the day. Everyone, and all of these reality programs and talk show programs.
I think confession has been the mode since Rousseau, you know. I mean, isn't the whole of Western individualism about...
Public confession is probably tied with the advent of... More so tied with the advent, because it's much easier to...
Oh, it's just become easier, but the desire... Yeah, but
the desire's there, but now the means are.
But I think what's important is the desire. The means obviously just proliferate everything. But, you know, you only need to read the kind of thing that Rousseau writes in Les Confessions about his masturbation and so on and so forth. That
and abandoning his children.
Yeah, which he doesn't even seem to feel is one of the major confessions. One of the whole ideas of the Western vision of the individual being in his relationship with the absolute on his own rather than in the community is that he wishes to confess to a very large degree everything that goes on in his head. At the same time, obviously, the simple nature of life means that it's extremely unwise if you wish to have any kind of relationship that continues. To do this, I think there's a constant tension between confession and living a double life. I think writers live that very much.
Because I was going to say, the mere fact that the Sun has laid the private life open, and the trouble that many writers get into, as you've just said. This is Cleaver in Tyrol, nor can there be any question of recommending anything to anyone, or of reporting home on any wisdom supposedly acquired. This whole desire and urge to share experience
and
with
to
others.
And to turn everything into documentaries and money. You know, like everybody who has any kind of experience it has to be a book. We're talking about the gesture of a man who's immensely powerful. I mean, who's also a famous documentary filmmaker. He's kind of a dumb talk show host or anything. And you sense that his decision to bail out goes way beyond the immediate problem of his son's book or this interview, to just a very deep feeling that the only real challenge left to him is the possibility of being alone with himself. How difficult that has become in the modern world, you know, with the emails and the mobile and the messages. Like,
it's all voluntary, though.
It's all voluntary, but like being a kid in a sweet shop, it does take a little time to learn not to reach out. The book is very largely about forcing himself into a position of silence.
Yeah, he had trouble with the clicker. He couldn't stop turning the television.
I think we all know that if you check into a hotel and you've got nothing to do, even though you think TV's awful, you'll probably turn it on at some point.
For company or whatever.
Well, no, you just do it. Even just to slag it off. So the book's largely about that. But if you go back, I want to try and get a sense of the meaning this might have in my life. You know, I grew up in this like super charismatic evangelical family where by the time I was in my late teens, all I wanted to do was to get out. Not so much my family, but that environment, that rhetoric, you know?
False rhetoric. Or they believed it, but...
Oh, they believed it 100%, but it's just an asphyxiating and coercive rhetoric that I wanted to be out of. And then later, there's another big moment in my life when I was in my early 20s in London and had been writing a lot and couldn't get published. And I felt immensely like the pressure of the whole London scene, the kind of talk you get in the newspapers, the talk on the television, like this constant and slightly complacent feeling of everything being established. This is the way of talking about this. So again, there was this other moment in my life where I decided to leave the UK, like partly because I'd met an Italian woman and we'd got married, and decided to go to Italy, where at that time, not understanding a word of Italian, there was a wonderful period of a couple of years. You couldn't get English radio in Italy. The phone cost a lot. There was no email, there was no mobile, there was no fax. You really were quite isolated.
Wine and a woman.
Yeah, I mean, there were other things. We did eat as well. To work quite a lot as well. And of course there was all the difficulty of learning Italian and learning to speak it. And so, but what I mean is, there was that very strong experience of removing oneself from a certain buzz. And then the experience of gradually becoming immersed in the Italian buzz, because obviously after 26 years, and I teach at the university and write for Corriere della Sera, so I'm very much in Italian life now. And then one moves back and forth between them, and you sense how much each language is a kind of enchantment and a kind of trap, and each one's separate from the other. It's only when you move between them that you become terribly aware of a new way of talking, thinking about everything and so on.
I think that's one of the real benefits of being bilingual, and that's that's why so many...
Bilingual societies obviously force you to be aware that there are two completely separate visions of what's going on.
Yeah,
and
different ways of coming at the same issue. Yeah.
And as soon as you know that there are two, you know that there are probably 2 million, so, that's a useful thing as far as one's work is concerned. So this gesture of Cleaver's of like the complete removal of himself from the world is, I think, something that in my own writing goes far back, and here is stated in its most extreme form. He imagines himself getting above the noise line, as he calls it, because he sees, and he's going to find a remote place to live above the noise line. But of course the real noise is in Cleaver's head, and the book is very largely about his dealings with that. He goes to the South Tyrol because it's a very anonymous place. It's not a place that's frequented by British tourists, really. And he hopes to be anonymous there. And he also goes there because he doesn't speak German. He did A-level German, but he doesn't speak German. And of course the irony is that as soon as he's meeting people there, he's trying to talk to them, because in the end, that's what he does. So there's a certain comedy in Cleaver's dealings with the local people of the South Tyrol, which is an area I know quite well because it's very close to where I live.
He says to himself, "You must just be here and nothing else."
Well, because he has this kind of habit of imagining himself in some sort of documentary movie presenting the world to everybody. Mm-hmm. I do have a little experience of being involved with documentaries, and I'm kind of appalled by how falsely they're set up.
And yet it's interesting when the British are heralded around the world for their objective.
Yeah, it's bullshit. It's bullshit.
I noticed that Cleaver is there's a line about his ambition, avarice, and appetite were incarnate, as his son puts it in the opening lines of his novel. "My father was as utterly incapable of leaving any woman alone as he was utterly, absolutely, and irremediably incapable of turning down any offer of food or drink or cigarettes, or even more chronically, any opportunity to appear in public at any moment of the day or night."
Well, that's his son's version of events.
So that's not you, then.
Well, absolutely. I wouldn't write about myself. How dull that would be.
Right.
Yeah. How dull that would be.
It's a craving. Fame and fortune and overindulgence is such a theme, particularly in the United States.
But let's go back again to Confessions. Precisely the nature of the confession is the hope that I will become famous by confessing something terribly interesting, right? I think the confessor wants to occupy a public space with his confession. Otherwise, he would confess it to his friend in a bar.
That's right, he wouldn't write it down.
Right. We could spend hours looking at the roots of individualism in the late medieval period and Christianity and so on. Well, there's a great line in Émile Cioran where he says, "Ever since people stopped believing in immortality, everybody writes." Okay, so there's this feeling that, if we have no metaphysic, if we're not going to heaven, at least we can be briefly famous.
Well, that's Shakespearean sonnets, of course, and he mentions that in one beautiful one. But so, yeah, that's a path to immortality, is to write something that stands the test of time and to have kids.
Yeah, I think there's a much greater solemnity in Shakespeare than what we're talking about here, though. What we're talking about here is kind of avid seeking of glory. And at the same time, Cleaver's intelligent enough to feel that is actually ugly, and that he would wish to be
Or empty, perhaps.
Yeah, he would wish to withdraw from that if only he could, and he's removing himself. I think we should say something here about the style of the book, which is, I hope, a little bit unusual. It's a book that shifts constantly between present and past tenses, even in the same sentence, and where constantly the son's book intrudes into Cleaver's mental space, with Cleaver apparently quoting from the son's book at length, to the extent that you begin seriously to disbelieve the possibility of Cleaver's having remembered so precisely what he's read in the son's book.
It's haunting him. It's almost in.
And you get a feeling that the son's book may indeed be a caricature of Cleaver, but at the same time it may be Cleaver himself rather paranoically imagining that the son's book was worse than it is. I mean, I don't know if you've ever had the misfortune of reading something about yourself. It can get extremely difficult to read it with a relaxed and serene mind, you know. It's like you tend to skip and what on earth how could he possibly say this about me, and so on and so forth. The book is a sort of collision of these factors and also just the ordinary people of the Tyrol kind of coming into it, and all the awful practical things of, you know, how to get to sleep in a cold bedroom, and was it wise to have a cold beer so late in the evening, and so on, and how am I going to lose this weight, because Cleaver is seriously overweight.
Falstaff comes to mind, and Gargantua.
He's clearly a Falstaffian figure, yeah. And I think anybody who works in the media, but even people who haven't worked in the media, must be familiar with this kind of figure of the very witty, rather overweight, heavy drinking, hard living, not unpleasant man, you know, an extremely charming fellow.
Certainly interesting company.
Yeah, which is what one wants in the end, you know. Spending time with nice people who have nothing to say to you is not very interesting.
Well, it's true. It's like if there's no disagreement, then what is there? There's not much to talk about after a while.
Yeah, I think with Cleaver also there's certainly an element probably of seduction in almost every relationship he's engaged in.
Yeah, you put it nicely. There's here it is right here. It's because it must be understood, again coming from the son, that my father couldn't speak to anyone, without trying to seduce them if they were a woman, or to coach them if they were a man. The intention being, my father explained, to instill in the viewer both intense anxiety and extreme complacency simultaneously. Cleaver's
been talking there about just about the whole way the media is packaged, and this whole aspect of the media that pretends to be information but actually isn't, that is a form of liturgy, like, you know, our constant need to know whether the Hang Seng has moved 0.5% up or down. You know, it's like, why do we even fucking well know what the Hang Seng is? You know, like for me, who make no investment, and, you know, what has this got to do with my life?
And what's important?
And yet, like at 7:30 in the morning, I'm being told that the Hang Seng has moved here or there. You know, and the Dow Jones and whatever.
Yeah. And who says that's important?
Well, right. Well, you can imagine that if the Dow Jones had moved 10%, you might want to say, uh-oh, times are changing. But, you know, the fact that it's moved 0.3, you know. So Cleaver's is an intelligent guy. He's very aware that actually what's happening here is that you're introducing a kind of rhythm into people's lives, a kind of collectivity, which is entrapping. The son's taken this on board. And Cleaver talks about the way the news is presented, these kind of collages of images and so on, the way they create a sense of drama, but at the same time they're reassuring because they're coming at you at the same time every day, you know, and it's so like, dun, 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 you know, 79 people dead in Baghdad, you know, horror, blood, this and that, but it's always going to be at 6 o'clock, and it's always going to last this long, so... And
it's going to be replaced by the next disaster, but...
Cleaver's terribly intelligent about all that, and yet was largely responsible for its development, and is bailing out of it.
Yeah, Neil Postman comes to mind. I don't know if you've read.
No, I haven't.
It's very, very good on this very topic.
Well, I'm sure loads of us are thinking constantly about: is there any hope that the world could live without this sort of thing? I suspect not, I suspect.
We talked about Walden. He doesn't want to Waldenize his to the quiet country, but we do have the choice of turning it off, and more and more people should and are, I believe, doing that because.
No, we have the choice. No, what I meant there was whether there is any chance that publicly the world could live without this. We can all individually decide to turn off the TV. I mean,
Well, there's all sorts of competition now to the television with the internet.
Yeah, unfortunately, the TV
and all that sort of thing is diminishing. The sources of information are diverse now to a point where almost anyone can become their own radio station.
Absolutely, well, weblogs and everything else in one way or another. Actually, I'm all for that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm all for the disintegration of this centralized voice.
You mentioned completely fake confrontation, as Cleaver talks about the media and the interviews that take place. The fact that it's completely fake, and yet the viewer is always complicit.
Yeah, let's talk about that for 1 minute, because it seems to me that a lot of people don't really take on board that. When I say fake, you know, there's BBC World kind of interviews where you get some really. They actually have a program called, I don't know, In the Hot Seat or In the Something Chair, and they'll have some interviewer trying to slay some guy, and they slog back and forth, right? And really, secretly, they may hate each other, but secretly they're allies in the show.
They want it to be interesting.
A really astonishing move would be if the interviewer said, well, you may have a point there, or something like that.
Almost like an opposition member saying, well, the government actually did a good job there.
Yeah. Identity is often created just by a series of oppositions. I mean, talking about that, I've written a lot about football, and I remember seeing on one of the chat lines where Verona fans were arguing with Vicenza fans, two cities close to each other which hate each other.
Sounds like Romeo and Juliet.
Well, but I'm sure that here in Canada there'll be two cities who are always at loggerheads over some game.
Montreal.
Right, okay. One guy comes out on the net and he says, guys, remember, you only exist insofar as we hate you. Right. Which is not stupid, because what he's saying is, you can only really be a big Vicenza fan if there's Verona to hate. What would you do without us? So let's go back to that thing. You've got these interviews which, pretend to be so revealing and everything, but actually are just, again, entirely predictable in their antagonisms. And the viewer is complicit to the extent in which, if he continues to watch, if he is aware that the stuff's stupid but still continues to watch it, then he's a supporter of the whole thing. And I think you really do have to have any kind of coherence inside your own mental life at all. You have to just decide, no, this stuff I'm not going to watch it. I'm not going to.
Well, and the TV programmers are not going to make this stuff if there's not an audience for it. So.
Well, it would be wonderful if a few more people turned off. Yeah.
Tim Parks. Getting back to Cleaver, our friend Cleaver, just in closing, within the first chapter of your book, quite frequent mention of these porcelain dolls, and Cleaver finally talks about wanting to be as thoughtless as a doll, as careless of heat and cold. Yeah.
What's funny about it is that they're also young women, and Cleaver has a very long track record in young women. And yet at the same time they're utterly cold and still. So there's...
women that he's been are utterly cold and still?
No, the dolls. The dolls are utterly cold and still. I think what's happening with Cleaver is, later in the book he comes across an accordion which is locked away in a cupboard in the place where he eventually ends up living way up at like 6,000 feet. And he pulls out the accordion and starts to play it, because he did play a little piano. Trouble is, he doesn't remember much of what he played, so what he finds himself playing is Should Old Acquaintance Be Forgot, which of course is the last thing that somebody walking out in the world should be singing, and Rock of Ages Cleft for Me. And what's happening, apart from his sense of the immense irritation that when he starts playing music, he actually just locks himself back into the past. I don't know if you know Rock of Ages Cleft for Me. You don't know that song?
If you sang it to me, I would.
Oh, I'm not going to sing it. Rock of Ages cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee, When I draw this fleeting breath, when my eyelids close in death, rock of ages cleft for me. There's this idea of like heaven opening to you. And of course he's right up there in the mountains with the rocks everywhere. And there is a slow realization, which goes back to what you said about the dolls, that beneath a lot of his behavior there's a death wish. That he has kind of fantasies of himself being, as it were, absorbed into the landscape. Western society is permeated by a very deep death wish, which tells us that real living begins after we're dead, as it were. And although that's human good health keeps that largely buried, there are many hymns whose sad cadences, I mean, if you even a hymn like Jerusalem, you know, I will not cease from mental strife, you know, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand. And you know that building Jerusalem here is actually beyond.
So many of the terrorists are driven by exactly that.
Yeah, although there's a kind of pathos about it. It's not an aggressive, it's not a blowing oneself to pieces thing. But I think a lot of hymns have a abide with me, fast falls the eventide. You know, there's this looking forward to the moment of twilight and death and trying to make it feel comfortable with metaphysics.
Which is so sad because it diminishes the present.
Well, it does. I think Cleaver becomes aware that in tension with his appetite and his seeking of celebrity, there is also this other side to him which kind of seeks to bury himself in the wilderness in a way. And he's dealing with that tension.
His appetites, women and food.
Women, food, glory of celebrity.
And I think he perhaps comes to the realization that this is vacuous and empty.
Well, he always knew that it was vacuous and empty, but funnily enough, knowing that it's vacuous and empty doesn't... I mean, the great mystery of life as he sees is that the awareness that celebrity is vacuous doesn't stop you from seeking it.
No, it's almost like you're addicted to it.
Well, I'm sure loads of talk show hosts are perfectly aware that it's vacuous, but you do it anyway because what else can you do?
You make money from it.
I mean, listen. Well, here we're getting to issues which are kind of profound to the way we all operate. It seems to me that in the West, a very large number of people have dumped any profound belief that would attach any absolute meaning to life, in the sense of the way a Christian metaphysic, a Christian creed would attach meaning to life. When you've dumped that, you can move to the absurdist position, which, you know, has already been stated in the 17th and 18th century by, I mean, somebody like the Italian poet Leopardi refers to the world as a solid nothing, you know. And
well before Beckett.
Oh, yeah. I mean, of course, and Beckett was a great Leopardi fan. As Leopardi saw it, the world is actually meaningless, and all we can do is try to create collective illusions which will give it meaning and health.
Like religion, that's what Pascal talked about.
Yeah, although Leopardi felt that it would have been possible to actually generate a religion, because at the same time you'd be perfectly aware that it was meaningless. And in fact, we do live in a kind of schizophrenia between creating meaning collectively and yet being aware that actually there is no meaning absolutely behind what we're doing. And sport, one of the reasons I've written a lot about sport is it seems to me a kind of parody version of what we do. Like, we create meaning around a game. We talk about our absolute faith in the team.
It's like an opium for the masses.
Right. Yeah, but the masses are not stupid. It's done ironically. Everybody knows that they don't really believe in the team. At the deepest possible level, they know that there are other important things in life. So that Cleaver's really trying to deal with that question there is, why did I spend so much energy building up a reputation, even after I'd long ceased to believe that there was any meaning in what I was doing? The book is
so
more...
coming to a midlife crisis then, or...
No, let's please leave that notion out. If Cleaver had a midlife crisis, it was years before. It seems, you know, a midlife crisis for people a little bit less sophisticated than Cleaver. You know, there are crises at every moment of life, depending on where you're up to and who leaves you and, you know, who betrays you. And so I really hate that expression. But there's a lot more in this book, because what's happening is that Cleaver also becomes dependent on people around him who he has to get food from, and the people who rent him, the house he lives in, and this family of people to whom he can't talk, where he realizes that some kind of drama is going on in their lives which he can't really understand because he can't communicate with them. So he begins to enter a different world, because in the the end, there is really no way out without it being the last way out, as it were. And he very slowly starts to, at first, rather perversely recreate his own family relationships with these people. But then slowly to try and just create relationships which are genuinely, simply relationships with these people.
A true connection that provides meaning.
Yeah, not a profound connection, but just a simple, modest vivendi with these other people. I mean, not that the book leads to a resolution which would suggest that I've solved the problem. If you are looking for the meaning of the life, world, and everything, I think The Hitchhiker's Guide has already solved that beyond any reasonable doubt.
62 or something?
Yeah.
Stupid thing like that.
I can't remember what the number was, yeah. I believe if you check on Google, if you type in the meaning of the life, the world, and everything, it actually gives you 62 or whatever it is.
So what is the meaning then? I've reached a point in my life where I know what I love to do, and it's exactly this. So what we've just done gives meaning to my life. What we have just done, exchanging ideas, thoughts about something that you've created from your imagination and connected that way.
What we have to do here is just look at the word meaning, and because as soon as human beings invent the word meaning, what it means is they've understood that life might be meaningless, because what you've done is you've divided the world into those things that create a sense of security, for mental security for you by having sense, and all the rest that is nonsense, right? So, I mean, the moment we invent the word meaning, we're clearly in big trouble, right? You've said that a conversation like this creates meaning. A conversation like this is fun, and it passes the time well, and it approaches our anxieties and maybe allows us to deal with some...
Not being alone, you mean?
No. But let's take the question of what a good novel is doing. It's trying to create a space where we can talk about things that are difficult for us, if it's a good novel. I mean, if it's just a feel-good novel, then frankly I don't want to read it. But look, the easiest way to talk about this is to go right back to the Iliad. You remember that wonderful moment when Helen's come back from Troy, she's been fucking around for 10 years, and now she's back home with Menelaus.
After tens of thousands.
All
for a woman.
Right, all hell has been let loose. And Odysseus' son comes along, Telemachus, and he thinks that his father is dead, and so he's not in good spirits. And they're all sitting together, and they want to talk. But the only thing they really need to talk about is just so painful to all three of them, because Menelaus feels that he's been a fool. Helen feels that she behaved badly. And Telemachus has to face his father's death, right? So they can't talk about it. And Homer says that Helen goes into the back room and gets a drug that had been given to her in Egypt, the properties of which are that if put in the wine, and wine is certainly an important element, they would allow you to talk about your brother's death with a smile on your face, right? So they unknowingly drink the drug, the other two, and they spend the whole evening chatting about what really matters to them, but which is really, in a sense, too difficult to talk about. And they have a good evening, and the next day they wake up and it's okay. And I think what most novelists are trying to do, or any good artist, whether visual or otherwise, is to find some kind of enchantment or drug which will allow you to bring into the frame the things that are difficult to talk about and make them a pleasure as well. So that when you read a book like Disgrace by Coetzee, he's talking about the most awful things, quite frankly. And it's an immense pleasure to read because he's put it in a way and framed it in a way that it's not reassuring, but it is a pleasure to go through that uneasiness with him.
That helps us to face the most frightening things that human beings face.
I'm not sure even about facing them, because it's only for the space of the book. Once the book's closed, it's not going to help you deal with rape or deal with... Do you see what I mean? But for the space of the book, it has been possible mentally to open up to that, and to think about it. And because books can be shared, for us two to meet who don't know each other and sense in that appreciation of what Coetzee did in that book, a certain sense of community.
So novels help us to connect. Tim Parks Thank you very much for this connection.
Well, thank you.
The novel is Cleaver. It's published by Secker and Marvel Secker in England. Not sure who publishes it here in Canada. Best of luck with the book.
Thanks.